I pulled my car onto the gravel driveway leading to my family ranch after 6 months of consecutive double shifts at a high-volume surgical center in Chicago. I had sent a total of $180,000 back home to renovate the old dairy barn into my dream residence. But the structure standing before me was not my home. A polished oak sign hung from the gate with the words "The Preston Reserve" etched into the wood. On the front porch, my brother Preston was raising a glass of expensive champagne with his fiancée while she flaunted a diamond engagement ring that my mother swore had been stolen from her jewelry box 2 years ago. They had not just stolen my house. They had erased my entire existence to clear a path for his perfect wedding. But they forgot one fundamental detail about the person whose name is on the mortgage paperwork. And I was about to make sure their celebration became the most expensive mistake of their lives. Before I tell you how I turned their dream wedding into a financial crime scene in less than an hour, I have a question for you. What would you do if you discovered your parents had taken your hard-earned money to build a future for their favorite child while leaving you with nothing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I am curious to see how you would handle this level of betrayal. The air in this part of the country always smelled like pine and wood smoke, a scent that usually brought me peace but now felt like a suffocating blanket. I sat in my car for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My body was screaming for rest. As a certified registered nurse anesthetist, my job involves keeping people alive in their most vulnerable moments. I manage complex drug interactions, monitor failing vital signs, and make split-second decisions where there is no room for error. I earn $250,000 a year because I am very good at what I do. But to my parents, Gerald and Diane, I was just a glorified assistant who got lucky with a high-paying job. The ranch had been in our family for 3 generations, but it was falling apart when I started my career. Gerald, a man who believed land should only be inherited by a son to carry on the family name, was drowning in property taxes and maintenance costs. 3 years ago, I offered them a deal that should have saved everyone. I told them I would fund the complete restoration of the large dairy barn and convert it into a luxury living space for myself. In exchange, they promised to subdivide the lot and transfer the deed for that specific acre to my name. They agreed so fast I should have seen the red flags then. I spent the last 36 months working 80-hour weeks. I took every difficult locum tenens assignment available, traveling to remote hospitals and living out of suitcases just to maximize my income. Every cent I didn't need for basic survival went into their bank account. I viewed the progress through digital photos and glowing email updates from Diane. She sent pictures of marble countertops, open-concept living areas, and the custom floor-to-ceiling windows I had always wanted. I trusted them because they were my blood. I thought my success was finally making Gerald proud. The sight of Preston on that porch changed everything. Preston is 28 years old and has never held a job for more than 4 months. He calls himself a real estate developer, but his only actual development is a growing list of failed ideas funded by my parents' retirement accounts. He lives on potential and the unearned praise Gerald heaps on him. Seeing him standing there, acting like the lord of a manor I paid for, made the exhaustion in my bones turn into a cold, sharp clarity. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't scream or cause a scene. My training in the operating room has taught me that panic is the enemy of a successful outcome. I slowly backed my car out of the driveway and drove toward the small town 5 miles away. I checked into a local hotel under my professional name, making sure I had a quiet place to think. My first instinct was to call Gerald, so I dialed his number and waited. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice sounding jovial and distracted. "Sloan," he said, "why are you calling during the day?" I told him I was just checking in on the construction progress. He didn't even hesitate before lying to me. He told me the contractor was facing major material delays and that the house wouldn't be ready for at least another month. He suggested I stay in Chicago and pick up a few more shifts since there was nothing for me to see here yet. I listened to the lie and realized my father didn't just view me as a daughter. He viewed me as a resource to be managed. I spent the next several hours on my laptop, accessing public land records and tax filings. What I found was a systematic betrayal that had been planned from the moment I sent the first wire transfer. The property had never been subdivided. Instead, Gerald and Diane had moved the entire ranch, including my new house, into a private family trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust was not me. It was Preston. They had used my high salary to increase the value of the land by hundreds of thousands of dollars, then quietly shifted the ownership to ensure Preston would never have to work a day in his life. The house I built was intended to be his marital home, a wedding gift from parents who had used my labor to buy it. They expected me to keep working, keep sending money, and keep quiet while they enjoyed the fruits of my exhaustion. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest, but as I looked at the legal documents on my screen, I noticed something they had overlooked. They thought they were playing a game of emotions, but I had been playing a game of documentation. Every dollar I sent was tracked. Every agreement was logged. They believed they had won, but they had actually walked right into a trap I didn't even know I was setting. I watched the sun go down from my hotel window, feeling the last of my childhood loyalty wither away. Tomorrow was the day of the rehearsal dinner. The entire town would be there to celebrate the golden son and his new estate. They wanted a show, and I was going to give them one they would never forget. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the dim light of the room and stared at the wall. My phone was silent on the nightstand. I had expected a barrage of calls from my mother asking where I was, but there was nothing. Their silence was the loudest confirmation I could have received. It meant they did not even know I had been there. They were too busy toasting to their own success and to the son who had never earned a single dollar of the fortune he was currently celebrating. To understand why I stood there for 10 years and let them bleed me dry, you have to understand the specific type of poison my family fed me since I was a child. It was not the kind that kills you instantly. It was the kind that accumulates in your system slowly until you are so sick you think the illness is your natural state. My father Gerald was a man who believed that women were meant to be support staff. In his world, men were the architects of destiny, and women were there to keep the coffee warm and the books balanced. When I announced I was going into nursing, Gerald scoffed at the dinner table. He told me it was a respectable job for a girl who wanted to find a doctor husband. He never understood the difference between a bedside nurse and a CRNA. When I finished my master's degree and passed my boards, I came home expecting pride. Instead, Gerald asked if I was finally done with school, so I could start helping out with the ranch expenses. He looked at my 6-figure starting salary not as an achievement, but as a family resource. Preston was different. Preston was the golden boy from the moment he was born. He was the heir to the family name and the land. He coasted through high school on charm and my old homework assignments. When he decided he wanted to be an entrepreneur, Gerald beamed with pride. He called Preston a visionary. The problem was that Preston's vision always required someone else's capital. The financial abuse started small. It began with little requests. A few $100s here for a truck repair. $1,000 there for a business license for a landscaping company that never planted a single tree. I paid it because I was the responsible sister. I paid it because every time I wrote a check, Diane would hug me and tell me I was the glue holding the family together. I was addicted to that praise. I was starving for it. Then the requests grew larger. 3 years ago, Preston decided he needed a new truck to look the part of a successful developer. Gerald called me late at night, his voice heavy with performative stress. He told me the old farm truck had died and they could not afford to replace it. He said Preston needed a reliable vehicle to help manage the property. I sent $40,000 the next morning. A week later, Preston posted a picture on social media with a brand new Ford Raptor that cost nearly $80,000. My $40,000 was just the down payment. Gerald and Diane had taken out a loan for the rest, putting the ranch up as collateral. When I asked about it, Diane told me to stop being so petty. She said Preston needed to project success to attract investors. I was working 60 hours a week in a high-trauma unit, standing on my feet for 12 hours at a time, intubating patients and managing critical airways while my brother drove a truck that cost more than my student loans. But I swallowed my anger. I told myself that family helps family. I told myself that if I just gave enough, eventually they would see me. Eventually they would look at me with the same adoration they saved for Preston. The idea for the barn renovation came from Diane. She called me one night while I was on a locum assignment in rural Alaska. It was dark and cold and I was lonely. She knew exactly which buttons to push. She told me they were getting older and the ranch was too much for them to handle alone. She said they wanted me to come home. She painted a picture of a multi-generational family estate where I would have my own space and my own life but still be close enough for Sunday dinners. She proposed that I pay to renovate the old dairy barn. It was a massive structure with good bones but a leaking roof. She said if I covered the construction costs, they would deed me the acre of land it stood on. It seemed like a fair trade. I would get a property worth $500,000 for the cost of renovation, and they would get their daughter back. I agreed. I hired a lawyer to draft a simple agreement, but Gerald waved it off. He told me he was insulted that I would bring lawyers into a family matter. He said his word was his bond. That was the moment I made the decision that would save me later. I did not insist on the contract because I wanted to fight them. I dropped the subject to keep the peace. But because I am a medical professional who deals with strict documentation and liability every single day, I could not just send money into a void. I needed a paper trail for my taxes. I set up a system where every transfer I made was classified as a personal loan with a forgivable clause upon the transfer of the deed. I used an electronic signature platform, DocuSign, because it was convenient for me while I was traveling. I told Gerald it was just for the IRS. I told him my accountant needed to categorize the outflow of cash so I wouldn't get audited. He laughed at my paranoia. He signed every single promissory note without reading them. He signed for the initial $50,000 for materials. He signed for the $20,000 for the roof. He signed for the $10,000 for the electrical wiring. Over 3 years, he signed 24 separate documents acknowledging a total debt of over $200,000 including interest. He thought he was signing meaningless tax forms. He didn't know he was signing his own financial death warrant. The renovation process was a nightmare of escalating costs. Diane was the project manager since I was away working. She would send me emails with subject lines like urgent decision needed. She told me the standard windows were on back order for 6 months, but we could get custom floor-to-ceiling glass if I sent another $8,000 today. She told me the foundation needed reinforcement that would cost another $15,000. I paid it all. I picked up extra shifts. I worked holidays. I missed my best friend's birthday party because I needed the double time pay to cover the new HVAC system Diane insisted we needed. I remember one specific visit home about a year into the project. I had driven 10 hours straight after a night shift to see the framing. I walked into the main house and found the family sitting in the living room. Preston was there with Bianca, a girl he had just started dating. She was the daughter of a local car dealership owner, and she dripped with attitude. She was looking at samples of marble for countertops. When I walked in, Diane quickly swept the samples off the table. She said they were just looking at ideas for the future. I sat down, exhausted, my eyes burning. Gerald looked at me and frowned. He told me I looked terrible. He said I was working too hard and that it was aging me. He turned to Preston and said that was why smart people worked with their brains and not their hands. He compared my job to manual labor. He said anyone could change a bedpan, but it took a real mind to build an empire. I felt a lump in my throat. I tried to explain that I didn't change bedpans. I tried to explain that I kept patients under anesthesia during open heart surgery. I tried to explain that one wrong calculation on my part could kill someone in seconds. Preston just laughed. He said it must be nice to have a job where you just follow doctor's orders all day. He said he had to make real decisions about market trends and asset allocation. I looked at Bianca. She was smirking. She looked at my simple scrubs and my messy bun, and then she looked at Preston in his designer polo shirt. She saw exactly what they wanted her to see. She saw a successful heir and his tired servant sister. The worst part was the gaslighting about the money. Every time I asked for a breakdown of the expenses, Diane would get defensive. She would cry. She would ask if I didn't trust my own mother. She would say that she was spending her days supervising dusty construction crews just for me, and this was how I thanked her. She made me feel guilty for asking where my $100,000 had gone. So I stopped asking. I just kept paying. I convinced myself that once the house was done, it would be worth it. I would have my sanctuary. I would have my deed. I would have my place in the family. I did not know then that the marble samples Bianca was looking at were for my kitchen. I did not know that the open concept layout was redesigned to host large parties for Preston's social climbing. I did not know that the reason the timeline kept getting pushed back was because they were waiting for me to pay for the high-end finishes that Bianca demanded. The final straw should have been 3 months ago. I was on the phone with Gerald and I mentioned that I was planning to move in by Christmas. There was a long silence on the line. He cleared his throat and told me that Christmas might be tight. He said Preston was going through a hard time with his business and might need to stay in the barn for a few weeks while he got back on his feet. He asked if I could stay in Chicago a little longer. I felt a cold dread in my stomach. I told him no. I told him the agreement was that the house was mine. Gerald's voice changed instantly. He became the patriarch. He told me I was being selfish. He said I had a luxury apartment in the city and I made plenty of money. He said Preston had nothing. He said it was my duty to help my brother. He said the house was on family land and that meant it belonged to the family, not just me. I hung up the phone shaking. That was the moment the doubt truly set in. That was the moment I started downloading the county land records. But even then, standing in that hotel room, part of me still wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. Part of me still wanted to believe that if I just explained it to them, they would fix it. But seeing the sign on the gate erased all of that. The Preston Reserve. It wasn't a temporary stay. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a total usurpation. They had taken my sweat, my tears, and my sleepless nights, and they had built a monument to their golden child. They had erased me completely. I lay back on the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling. The tears finally stopped. The sadness was replaced by the same cold, clinical detachment I felt in the operating room when a patient started to crash. Panic does not save lives. Precision saves lives. I reached for my laptop bag. I didn't need to scream at them. I didn't need to beg them for fairness. I had something better than fairness. I had 24 promissory notes, legally binding and digitally time-stamped. I had proof of wire transfers. I had the deed history showing the transfer to the trust. They had treated me like a bank for 10 years. Now the bank was calling in the loan. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to my lawyer in Chicago. I needed a shark, and I knew exactly who to call. The wedding was in 24 hours. That was plenty of time to prepare an emergency injunction. I slept soundly for the first time in months. The patient was critical, but the treatment plan was clear. I was about to perform a radical excision of the tumor that had been killing me for a decade. The next morning I woke up before the sun. The hotel room was cold and smelled of stale air conditioning. I made coffee using the cheap machine in the corner, the bitter taste grounding me in reality. My phone still showed no missed calls from my parents. It was as if I had ceased to exist the moment I stopped sending checks. I dressed in a pair of sharp black trousers and a silk blouse I had packed for a medical conference. I needed to look like a professional, not the daughter they could dismiss. I drove to the county clerk's office as soon as it opened at 8 o'clock. This was a small town, the kind of place where records were still kept in physical ledgers alongside the digital files. The clerk was a woman I recognized from high school, someone who had stayed behind while I left for the city. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and recognition. I told her I needed to pull the property records for my family's address. She smiled and said she had heard about the big wedding at the new estate. She asked if I was excited for my brother. I didn't answer. I just asked for the complete transaction history for the last 5 years. She printed out a stack of papers and handed them to me. I took them to a quiet corner of the office and began to read. My hands were steady, my breathing controlled. This was just data. This was just a patient chart revealing the underlying disease. The first few documents were standard. The original deed in Gerald's name. The mortgage refinance from 10 years ago. But then I saw it. A document dated 6 months ago. It was a quitclaim deed transferring the entire property, including the main house, the barns, and the 40 acres of land, from Gerald and Diane to the Preston Family Irrevocable Trust. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. An irrevocable trust is a powerful legal instrument. Once assets are placed inside it, they are incredibly difficult to remove. It is often used to protect assets from creditors or to manage inheritance taxes. I flipped to the next page to see the trust agreement details. The grantor was Gerald. The trustee was Diane. And the sole beneficiary, entitled to all income and residence rights upon the death of the grantors or at their discretion, was Preston. My name was nowhere. I read it again. I scanned every line looking for a mistake. Maybe there was a secondary beneficiary clause. Maybe there was a subdivision pending for the acre I had paid for. There was nothing. The document was airtight. They had not just failed to subdivide the land. They had actively transferred the land I paid to improve into a legal entity designed to benefit only Preston. The date of the transfer was the most damning piece of evidence. It was signed exactly 2 weeks after I sent the final payment of $45,000 for the interior finishing. They waited until the check cleared. They waited until the contractors were paid. Then they signed the papers to lock me out forever. This was not accidental. This was premeditated financial execution. Gerald had planned this. He knew I would never agree to pay for a house I didn't own, so he dangled the promise of a deed like a carrot. He used my money to increase the property value by nearly $500,000, and then he gifted that equity to his son. I sat there for a long time. The betrayal was so absolute it was almost impressive. It was a surgical strike on my future. They knew I was single. They knew I worked dangerous hours. In their twisted logic, I was the expendable resource. I was the worker bee whose honey was harvested to feed the queen. Preston was the legacy. I was just the funding. I took out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every page. Then I called my lawyer in Chicago. His name is David, and he specializes in contract law and asset recovery. He has a reputation for being ruthless. I had him on retainer for my contract work as a freelancer, but I had never needed him for something personal. I explained the situation calmly. I told him about the renovation, the promise of the deed, and the trust one had just discovered. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. He told me that without a written contract for the renovation in exchange for the deed, I was in a difficult position. He said that generally improvements to land become part of the land, and if I couldn't prove a contract existed, the law might view my payments as a gift. My heart sank. I felt the first stirring of real panic. Had I really been that stupid? Had I really thrown away 3 years of my life on a verbal promise from a man who lied for a living? Then I remembered the DocuSign files. David, I said, cutting him off. I didn't treat these payments as gifts. Every single transfer, from the first $10,000 to the last $45,000, was accompanied by a promissory note. I made Gerald sign them. They are structured as personal loans with a balloon payment due upon the transfer of the deed. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then David asked me to clarify the terms of the notes. I opened my laptop right there in the clerk's office and pulled up the files. I read him the standard clause I had inserted. The borrower agrees to repay the principal plus interest at the federal minimum rate. Repayment is deferred until the subdivision and transfer of the property deed to the lender. In the event of default, or if the property is sold or transferred to a third party without the lender's consent, the entire loan becomes immediately due and payable. David started laughing. It was a dry, sharp sound. He told me I was a genius. He said that by transferring the property to the trust, Gerald had triggered the default clause. The trust was a third party. Technically, Gerald had transferred the collateral without satisfying the lien. He asked me how much the total was. I checked the spreadsheet. $210,000 including the accrued interest. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted my money back. All of it. And I wanted to burn their little kingdom to the ground. David told me to sit tight. He said he would draft a notice of default and an emergency motion for a prejudgment writ of attachment. He explained that because the loan was now due and they had attempted to hide assets by moving them into a trust, we had grounds to freeze the property. He said he could have a local process server deliver the papers within 24 hours. I told him 24 hours was too long. The wedding was today. The rehearsal was last night, but the ceremony was at 4 o'clock this afternoon. David paused. He asked if I wanted to stop the wedding. I told him I didn't care about the wedding. I cared about the asset. I told him that if they were hosting a 300-person event on the property, they were likely violating the terms of the insurance policy I knew they couldn't afford. But more importantly, I wanted to serve them when they couldn't run away. I wanted to serve them when they were surrounded by the very people they were trying to impress. We spent the next 2 hours on the phone finalizing the strategy. David would file the motion electronically with the local court. He had a contact in the county judge's office who could expedite the review given the evidence of fraudulent transfer. The goal was to get a temporary restraining order on the asset, effectively freezing the trust. By noon, I had the documents. I printed them out at the hotel business center. The stack of paper felt heavy in my hands. It wasn't just paper. It was my life. It was every missed holiday. It was every night I slept in a hospital on-call room. It was every time I ate a vending machine dinner because I was saving money for the marble countertops Bianca was now claiming were hers. I decided to drive by the property one last time before the main event. I parked my car down the road, hidden by a line of trees. I watched through binoculars. The transformation was sickeningly beautiful. White tents were set up on the lawn. Floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first car lined the aisle. I saw caterers unloading trays of food. I saw a string quartet tuning their instruments. And I saw Preston. He was walking around the property with a strut that made my stomach turn. He was pointing at things, giving orders to people who were actually working. He looked like he owned the world. He was wearing a custom suit. I wondered if I had paid for that too. Then I saw Gerald. He was laughing with a group of men, clapping them on the back. He looked relieved. He looked like a man who had gotten away with the perfect crime. He had offloaded his debt, secured his son's future, and erased his daughter, all without lifting a finger. The rage I felt was different now. It wasn't hot. It was absolute zero. It was the kind of focus I had when a patient was coding. I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to just serve them papers. I was going to dismantle their reality. I drove back to town and went to the bank. I withdrew $5,000 in cash. Not for me, but for the process server I was meeting. I wanted to make sure he was motivated. I met him at a diner near the courthouse. His name was Hank, a big man with a tired face who looked like he had seen everything. I showed him the papers. I showed him the photos of the wedding setup. I told him I needed him to walk right up the aisle if necessary. Hank looked at the papers, then at the cash, then at me. He smiled and said he didn't like wedding cake anyway. The plan was set. We would arrive at 3:30. Guests would be seated. The ceremony was scheduled for 4. We would hit them right before the bride walked down the aisle. I went back to my hotel room to change. I put on the most expensive dress I owned. It was a structured navy blue sheath that made me look like a CEO. I did my makeup with precision. I pulled my hair back into a tight chignon. I looked in the mirror and I didn't see the tired nurse who begged for affection. I saw the creditor. I thought about calling Diane one last time. I thought about giving her a chance to explain. But then I remembered the trust document. I remembered the date. They had 6 months to tell me. They had 6 months to say, Sloan, we changed the plan. They had 6 months to be honest. They chose silence. They chose theft. I picked up my purse and the folder containing the original promissory notes. I walked out of the hotel room and didn't look back. The drive to the ranch felt shorter this time. The sky was a brilliant blue, perfect for a wedding. Perfect for a reckoning. As I turned onto the main road leading to the property, I saw the line of luxury cars waiting to turn in. Mercedes, BMWs, Range Rovers, Bianca's family and friends. The parking attendants were directing them to the field next to the barn. My barn. I pulled up to the gate. The security guard, a local kid I didn't know, tried to stop me. He asked for my invitation. I looked him in the eye and held up the legal file. I told him I was the owner of the property and I didn't need an invitation to enter my own land. He looked confused, but the authority in my voice made him step back. He waved me through. I drove up the long gravel driveway, the dust billowing behind me. I parked my car right in front of the main house, blocking the path of the white vintage Rolls-Royce that was waiting to transport the bride. I stepped out of the car. The air was filled with the smell of expensive perfume and anticipation. I took a deep breath. It was time to collect. I stepped out of my car and the heat of the afternoon sun hit me, but I felt nothing but a cold, numb sensation spreading through my chest. The security guard was still radioing ahead, but I was already walking up the stone path to the front door. The house I had paid for looked magnificent. The landscaping was manicured to perfection with rows of white hydrangeas that I had specifically requested 3 years ago because they were my grandmother's favorite flower. Diane had told me they were too expensive to plant. Yet here they were blooming in full force to welcome a bride who probably couldn't tell a hydrangea from a weed. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. The foyer was buzzing with activity. Photographers were snapping shots of the groomsmen. A makeup artist was rushing by with a belt full of brushes. The air smelled of hairspray and expensive lilies. I stood there for a moment like a ghost in my own dream. This was the exact entryway I had designed on a napkin in a hospital cafeteria 2 years ago. I had wanted a grand entrance for family Christmases. Instead, it was a staging area for my erasure. I found my mother in what was supposed to be the library but had been converted into a bridal holding room. Diane was adjusting the veil on Bianca's head. Gerald was standing by the window, holding a tumbler of scotch, looking out at the guests arriving on the lawn. When the door clicked shut behind me, the room went silent. Diane turned around. Her face went through a complex series of gymnastics. Shock, then fear, then a sudden plastered smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sloan," she said, her voice pitched a little too high. "You made it. We were worried you wouldn't come after you didn't answer your phone." I didn't smile back. I looked at Gerald, who had turned from the window. He looked annoyed rather than happy to see me. "You're late, Sloan," he said gruffly. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. You need to get to your seat. You're in the 3rd row behind the cousins." The 3rd row. I had paid for the roof over their heads and the floor beneath their feet, and they had seated me in the 3rd row behind cousins we saw once a decade. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice steady. "Both of you." "Alone." Bianca turned from the mirror. She looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than my first year of nursing school. She looked me up and down with a sneer that was barely concealed. "This is my bridal suite, Sloan," she said. "If you want to catch up with your parents, you can do it at the reception. I have a schedule to keep." I ignored her and kept my eyes on my father. "I know about the trust, Gerald. I know about the deed transfer." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Diane's hands froze on the veil. Gerald's face turned a shade of red that suggested unmanaged hypertension. He took a sip of his scotch and set the glass down with a sharp clink. "This is hardly the time or the place," he hissed. "We are hosting 300 people. We can discuss administrative details next week." "It is not an administrative detail," I said, walking further into the room. "It is theft. You transferred the property to the Preston family Irrevocable Trust 2 weeks after I wired the final payment. You used my money to build equity, and then you stole it." Diane rushed forward, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. "Sloan, honey, keep your voice down. You don't understand. It's complicated financial planning. Your father did it to protect the asset. It's for the family." "For the family," I repeated. "Or for Preston?" "Because the trust document lists him as the sole beneficiary. My name isn't on it." Gerald stepped between me and his wife, his chest puffed out in that familiar posture of dominance he used whenever I questioned him. "You are being hysterical," he said. "You have a good job. You have your own life in the city. Preston needs this. He is starting a family. He needs a foundation. You are a single woman, Sloan. What do you need a 4-bedroom estate for? It would just go to waste." There it was. The naked truth I had been denying for years. It wasn't about money. It was about worth. In their eyes, my value was purely extractive. I was a natural resource to be mined until I was empty, while Preston was a monument to be preserved. I looked at Bianca. She was watching the exchange with a look of bored superiority. She raised her hand to smooth her hair, and that was when I saw it. The ring. It wasn't the engagement ring I had seen on the porch the day before. This was a different ring. It was a vintage sapphire surrounded by old European cut diamonds. It was my grandmother's ring. The one she had worn every day of her life. The one she had promised to me on her deathbed when I was 16. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Diane had told me that ring was lost. She said it had disappeared during a move 2 years ago. We had searched for weeks. I had cried over that ring. I pointed at Bianca's hand. My finger was shaking. "Where did you get that?" Bianca looked at the ring and shrugged. "Oh, this." Diane gave it to me as a something blue. "It's a family heirloom. It fits the vintage theme perfectly, don't you think?" I turned to my mother. "You told me it was lost. You told me you looked everywhere." Diane had the grace to look ashamed for a split second before she hardened her expression. "It's a tradition, Sloane. The ring goes to the bride of the eldest son. It's meant to stay in the family name. Since you haven't found anyone, it just made sense to pass it to someone who is actually building a future for the family." Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud crack. It was the quiet sound of a flatline. The hope that I had been carrying around like a heavy stone for 32 years finally died. I realized then that there was nothing I could do to make them love me. I could buy them 10 houses. I could give them all my money. I could bleed myself dry until I was a husk, and they would just step over my body to hand a glass of champagne to Preston. The pain vanished. It was replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a scalpel. I looked at them. I really looked at them. I saw a weak man who bullied his daughter to feel powerful. I saw a mother who traded her integrity for the approval of a son who didn't respect her. And I saw a spoiled girl playing dress-up in my house wearing my inheritance. "I am giving you one chance," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was almost conversational. "One chance to fix this. Sign a document acknowledging the debt today. Acknowledge that the renovation money is a loan. Put me back on the deed. Do it now and I walk out of here and let you have your party." Gerald laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. "Or what, Sloane? You'll cry. You'll make a scene. Go ahead. Everyone out there knows you're just the jealous older sister who couldn't get a husband. No one will listen to you." "I don't need them to listen to me," I said. "I need them to listen to the law." "Get out," Gerald snarled. "Get out of my house before I have security throw you out. You are ruining your brother's day and I won't have it. You are ungrateful. After everything we did to raise you." I looked at him one last time. I memorized the contempt on his face. I wanted to remember it when things got hard later. I wanted to remember that he chose this. "I'm leaving," I said. "Enjoy the wedding." I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently. I walked back down the hallway, past the photos of Preston that lined the walls. There were no photos of me. I walked out the front door and onto the porch. The guests were being ushered to their seats. The string quartet was playing Canon in D. It was a beautiful scene. A perfect tableau of wealth and happiness built on a foundation of fraud. I saw Hank, the process server, standing near the back of the seating area. He was wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit him well, but he blended in enough with the catering staff. He caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. He was ready. I walked over to the side of the house where the main power breaker was located. I knew exactly where it was because I had paid $6,000 to have the electrical panel upgraded to handle the load of the new commercial-grade kitchen appliances Diane wanted. I stood there for a moment listening to the music. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from David, my lawyer. "Motion granted. The judge signed the emergency writ. The lien is active. The sheriff has been notified." I looked at the screen and felt a surge of adrenaline. It was done. The legal trap was sprung. But I wasn't satisfied with just a piece of paper. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to erase me. I needed to make sure that was impossible. I walked back to the seating area and found a seat in the back row. Not the third row. The back row. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to see the moment their world collapsed. Preston walked down the aisle first. He looked handsome and smug, shaking hands with the guests. He stood at the altar puffing out his chest just like his father. Then Gerald walked Diane down the aisle. She was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, playing the role of the proud mother to perfection. The music swelled. The guests stood up. The doors of the house opened and Bianca stepped out. She looked radiant in the afternoon sun. The diamonds on her fingers sparkled. My grandmother's diamonds. As she reached the altar, the music faded. The officiant began to speak. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I just stood up in the silence of the ceremony. Heads turned. People whispered. Gerald looked at me with fury in his eyes. He made a gesture for me to sit down. I didn't sit. I raised my hand and signaled to Hank. He stepped out from the shadows and walked straight down the center aisle. His heavy boots crunched on the white runner. The sound was jarring against the delicate atmosphere. The officiant stopped speaking. Preston looked confused. "Who is that?" he whispered loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Hank didn't stop until he reached the altar. He walked right past the groomsmen, right past the bridesmaids, and stopped in front of Preston and Gerald. "Are you Preston Jacob Miller?" he asked, his voice booming. "Yes," Preston said, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" Hank pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. "I am serving you with a court order for an emergency writ of attachment and a notice of foreclosure on this property." "Foreclosure?" Preston squeaked. "That's impossible. We own this place." "Not anymore," Hank said, handing him the papers. "And you?" he turned to Gerald, handing him a second stack. "You are served with a lawsuit for fraud, breach of contract, and theft by deception. The judge has ordered an immediate freeze on all assets held by the Preston Family Trust. This property is now a seized asset pending litigation." A gasp went through the crowd. It started as a ripple and turned into a wave. Gerald turned purple. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "My daughter." He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She's doing this. She's crazy." Hank turned to the crowd. "Folks, I am sorry to interrupt the festivities, but this venue is currently a crime scene under investigation for mortgage fraud. I strongly suggest you vacate the premises." Chaos erupted. I watched from the back row. I watched Bianca drop her bouquet. I watched Diane collapse into a chair, sobbing not for her daughter, but for her reputation. I watched Preston look at the papers in his hand like they were written in an alien language. And then I watched Gerald. He looked across the sea of confused guests and locked eyes with me. He didn't see the submissive nurse anymore. He saw the architect of his destruction. I picked up my clutch and turned around. The show was over. The patient had flatlined. It was time to call the time of death. The silence that followed the process server's announcement was heavy enough to crush a lung. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind rustling through the expensive floral arrangements and the distant hum of the catering generators. Then, the murmuring began. It started as a low buzz and quickly escalated into a roar of confusion and outrage. Bianca's father, a man named Robert who owned the largest chain of car dealerships in the state, stood up from the front row. He was a man used to being in control, and his face was turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched up the aisle, stepping over the white runner with his expensive loafers, and confronted Gerald. "Gerald, what is the meaning of this?" Robert demanded, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Why is there a sheriff's deputy threatening to seize the property on my daughter's wedding day?" Gerald was sweating profusely now. He wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "Robert, please, it's a misunderstanding. My daughter. She's having a mental breakdown. She's jealous of Preston. She's making up lies to ruin the day. We own this land. It's been in the family for generations." "That is a lie," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaos like a scalpel. I walked from the back of the seating area toward the altar. The guests parted for me, their eyes wide. I wasn't the invisible sister anymore. I was the person holding the detonator. I reached the front and stood next to Hank. I opened my clutch and pulled out a single blue folder. I handed it to Robert. "Read the first page, Robert," I said calmly. "It's a copy of the deed transfer Gerald signed 6 months ago." Robert snatched the folder and scanned the document. His eyes narrowed. He looked at Gerald, then back at the paper. "It says here the property was transferred to the Preston Family Irrevocable Trust." "Exactly," I said. "And who is the beneficiary?" Robert flipped the page. "Preston Miller." I nodded. "Now, look at the next document. It's a promissory note dated 3 years ago. It details a loan of $210,000 from me to Gerald Miller for property improvements." Gerald lunged forward. "That's fake. I never signed a loan. She said she was paying for the renovation as a gift. She's forging my signature." I turned to my father with a look of pity. "I didn't forge anything, Dad. You signed it electronically. Via DocuSign. Do you remember those emails I sent you? The ones you said were just tax formalities?" The ones you didn't read because you were too busy telling me how smart Preston was? Gerald's face went slack. He remembered. I could see the memory hitting him. He had clicked sign all without reading a single word because he didn't respect me enough to think I would outsmart him. He thought I was just a nurse doing paperwork. He didn't realize I was a creditor securing an asset. I turned back to Robert. The loan agreement has a specific clause. Clause 4, Section B. It states that if the property is transferred to a third party, including a trust, without the lender's consent, the full amount of the loan becomes immediately due and payable. It's called an acceleration clause. I looked at Preston, who was trembling in his custom suit. By transferring the deed to the trust to cut me out, you triggered the default. You owe me $210,000. Right now. Or the property goes to foreclosure auction to satisfy the debt. Preston looked at his father. Dad? Is this true? Did you sign that? Gerald sputtered. I didn't know. I thought it was just. He didn't read it. I finished for him. Because he thinks he's the only one in the family with a brain. Robert closed the folder with a snap. He looked at Gerald with pure disgust. You told me you owned this estate free and clear. You told me my daughter was marrying into a legacy. You're telling me you're bankrupt? That you're squatting in a house paid for by your daughter? It's not like that. Gerald pleaded. We have assets. We have. You have nothing, I interrupted. You have a mountain of debt and a trust fund that owns a property with a lien on it. Robert turned to his daughter. Bianca, let's go. Bianca looked at Preston. She looked at the house. She looked at the ring on her finger. But Preston, she whispered. The wedding. There is no wedding, Robert barked. I am not letting you marry a fraud who can't even pay his own sister back. Bianca looked at Preston one last time. Her eyes were filled with tears, but behind the tears, I saw the calculation. She was a survivor, just like me, but in a different way. She realized the ship was sinking, and she wasn't going to drown with the rats. She pulled the ring off her finger. My grandmother's ring. She looked at it for a second, then looked at me. She walked over and pressed the ring into my hand. He told me he bought it, she said, her voice trembling. He told me he bought it at an auction in New York. He lied about everything. She turned to Preston. You're pathetic, she spat. Then she gathered her skirts and ran toward her father's car. Preston stood there, abandoned at the altar. He looked at the empty space where his bride had been. Then he looked at me. His face crumpled. He didn't look like a developer or a visionary anymore. He looked like a child who had dropped his ice cream. How could you? He sobbed. How could you do this to me? It's my wedding day. You did this to yourself, Preston, I said coldly. You and Dad. You thought you could erase me. You thought you could take my money, my home, and my dignity, and I would just smile and say thank you. You forgot one thing. What? He sniffled. I'm the one who keeps you alive, I said. I'm the one who paid the bills. I'm the one who fixed the problems. And when you cut off the life support, the patient dies. I turned to the crowd of guests who were still watching in stunned silence. The wedding is canceled, I announced. Please vacate the property immediately. The sheriff will be securing the premises in 1 hour. The guests didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled for their cars. It was a stampede of silk and expensive leather. Within minutes, the driveway was a traffic jam of fleeing luxury vehicles. I watched them go. I felt a strange sense of calm. My heart rate was steady. My hands were still. Diane was sitting on a folding chair, weeping into her hands. Gerald was standing next to her, staring at the ground, defeated. Hank, the process server, was leaning against a pillar, looking bored. He had done his job. I walked over to Gerald. You have 30 days to vacate, I said. That's the legal standard for eviction after foreclosure begins. I suggest you start packing. Gerald looked up. His eyes were red. You're my daughter, he whispered. How can you be so cruel? I'm not cruel, Dad, I said. I'm just efficient. You taught me that women should be practical. Well, practically speaking, you are a bad investment. I walked over to where Preston was sitting on the altar steps, his head in his hands. I looked down at him. You wanted a legacy, Preston? I asked. Now you have one. You'll be the man who lost everything because he was too lazy to read a contract. I turned and walked back down the aisle. The white runner was stained with dirt from Hank's boots. The flowers were wilting in the heat. The dream was dead. I got into my car and drove away. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the family I was leaving behind. I drove straight to the jeweler in the next town over. I placed the ring on the counter. The jeweler, an old man with a loupe, looked at it. "It's beautiful," he said. "Family heirloom?" "Yes," I said. "But the family is gone." I had the ring cleaned and resized to fit my right hand. I wasn't going to wear it as a symbol of marriage. I was going to wear it as a symbol of survival. That night, I sat in my hotel room and drank a glass of wine. My phone was finally silent. No one was calling to ask for money. No one was calling to demand my time. For the first time in 10 years, I was truly, completely free. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. David, my lawyer, was a shark. He pushed the foreclosure through with terrifying speed. Gerald tried to fight it, but the DocuSign logs were irrefutable proof. The judge ruled in my favor within the month. The property was seized. The Preston family trust was dissolved. The house I had built was put up for auction to satisfy the debt. I didn't buy it back. I didn't want it anymore. It was tainted. Instead, I took the payout from the auction. After paying off the lien and the legal fees, I walked away with almost $300,000. It was more than I had put in, thanks to the appreciation in value and the interest on the loan. Gerald and Diane were forced to move into a small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a humiliating come-down for people who had prided themselves on being landed gentry. Preston, humiliated and broke, moved to a different state to stay with a distant cousin. He couldn't show his face in town anymore. The story of the wedding had become local legend. I went back to Chicago. I went back to my job. But something had changed. I wasn't the tired, desperate nurse anymore. I walked into the operating room with a new sense of authority. I realized that if I could dismantle a decades-long system of abuse in a single afternoon, I could handle anything. I used the money to buy a penthouse in the city. It was modern, sleek, and entirely mine. No one had a key but me. 6 months later, I received a letter. It was from Diane. The handwriting was shaky. "Sloan," it read. "Your father had a stroke last week. The doctors say it was stress. We can't afford the rehabilitation center. Please. We are family." I read the letter twice. I thought about the years of neglect. I thought about the 3rd row at the wedding. I thought about the ring on Bianca's finger. I took a pen and wrote a response on the back of the envelope. "I am sorry to hear that. I recommend applying for Medicaid. I am no longer the family bank." I put it in the mailbox and walked away. I had learned the most important lesson of my life. You cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. Sometimes, you have to let go of the rope to save yourself. I looked down at the sapphire ring on my right hand. It sparkled in the city lights. It was heavy, cold, and beautiful. Just like the truth. The surgery was a success. The tumor was removed. The patient survived. And that patient was me. It has been exactly 12 months since I walked out of that wedding. The seasons have changed, and with them so has the landscape of my life. I am writing this from the balcony of my new penthouse in Chicago. The wind off the lake is cold, but it feels clean. It feels like my own. The fallout from that day was not swift. It was a slow and painful grinding of gears as the machinery of my family's lives finally broke down completely. The foreclosure auction took place 3 months after the wedding. I did not attend. David handled everything. He told me the property sold for less than market value because of the stigma attached to it. The locals called it the cursed estate. Gerald and Diane were evicted by the sheriff. It was a public spectacle that my father never recovered from. The shame of being removed from the land he claimed to be lord of broke something fundamental in his mind. 2 months ago, he suffered a massive stroke. It left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Diane called me to ask for money for a private nursing facility. She said he deserved dignity. I told her that dignity is something you build with your actions, not something you buy with your daughter's money. I sent her the contact information for the state Medicaid office. It was not cruelty. It was the natural consequence of a lifetime of poor financial planning. He is now in a state-funded facility. I do not visit. I cannot look at the man who tried to erase me and feel anything other than a dull, distant pity. Preston did not become a real estate mogul. The fraud allegations followed him. Bianca's father made sure that every business owner in the county knew exactly what kind of man Preston was. He moved 3 states away. The last I heard from a distant cousin is that he is working as an assistant manager at a car wash. He lives in a studio apartment and takes the bus to work. The golden child is finally learning the value of $1 the hard way. As for me, the silence is the best part. For years, my phone was a source of anxiety. Every ring meant a demand. Every text meant a guilt trip. Now, when my phone rings, it is usually a colleague asking to grab dinner or a friend inviting me to a gallery opening. I have reclaimed my time. I kept the sapphire ring. I wear it on my right hand every day. It serves as a constant reminder of the price of my freedom. It reminds me that I am capable of saving myself. I had it appraised recently, and the jeweler told me the setting was loose. He said it looked like it had been tampered with. It turns out the prongs had been pried open and then hastily pushed back. It made me realize that they hadn't just stolen the ring. They had likely tried to sell the stone and failed before giving it to Bianca. Even their heirloom gift was a failed transaction. I have started a scholarship fund for nursing students who come from difficult family backgrounds. I want to help young women who are trying to build a life for themselves without a safety net. I tell them my story not to scare them but to arm them. I tell them that financial independence is the only true security a woman has. There is a concept in economics called the sunk cost fallacy. It is the idea that you should keep investing in a losing proposition just because you have already put so much into it. My family was my sunk cost. I kept pouring love and money into a black hole hoping that eventually it would fill up and they would love me back. But black holes do not fill up. They only consume. Walking away was the hardest financial decision I ever made, but it was the most profitable one for my soul. I lost a brother and parents, but I found myself. I found the Sloan who is a brilliant anesthetist. I found the Sloan who loves opera and expensive wine. I found the Sloan who deserves to be in the first row of her own life, not the third row of someone else's. If you are listening to this story and you feel a tightening in your chest because it sounds familiar, I want you to know something. You are not a bad person for saying no. You are not a bad daughter or son for protecting your future. You cannot light yourself on fire just to keep others warm. They will only complain that you are not burning bright enough. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, check the records. If the math doesn't add up, do not ignore it. And never ever sign a document you haven't read. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button so it can reach others who might need to hear this warning. If you have ever had to cut off a toxic family member to save yourself, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to see more stories about justice being served, make sure you are subscribed. Thank you for watching. Remember that your worth is not determined by what you provide for others. It is determined by what you preserve for yourself.